King and the Civil Rights Movement, Part 1, by Sanderson Beck. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. Martin Luther King, Jr., Stride Toward Freedom. With nonviolent resistance, no individual or group need submit to any wrong, nor need anyone resort to violence in order to right a wrong. Martin Luther King, Jr. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. Martin Luther King, Jr., Letter from Birmingham Jail. Unearned suffering is redemptive. Suffering, the nonviolent resistor realizes, has tremendous educational and transforming possibilities. Martin Luther King, Jr., Stride Toward Freedom. Today, the choice is no longer between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence. Martin Luther King, Jr., Stride Toward Freedom. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation and the creation of the beloved community, while the aftermath of violence is tragic bitterness. Martin Luther King, Jr., Stride Toward Freedom. NAACP, CORE, and Desegregation. In 1909, William Lloyd Garrison's grandson, Oswald Garrison Villard, wrote a call for a national conference to renew the struggle for civil liberty. Supported by Jane Addams, William Dean Howells, Ida B. Wells, John Dewey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others, they formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. Du Bois became director of publicity and research and began editing and writing for the Crisis magazine. Arthur B. Spingarn led the legal effort and got the grandfather clauses that blocked descendants of non-voters, slaves, from voting declared unconstitutional. In 1921, the NAACP had more than 400 branches in the United States. Howard University Law School Dean Charles Houston worked for the NAACP and in 1935 launched a campaign to remedy educational inequalities. He was assisted by young Thurgood Marshall and in 1938 argued before the U.S. Supreme Court that Lloyd Lionel Gaines had a right to attend the University of Missouri School of Law. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, who was president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, called upon African Americans to march on Washington to demand an end to racial discrimination in government hiring and an end to the segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. Randolph and NAACP Executive Secretary Walter White met with President Franklin Roosevelt before the march, and on June 25th, Roosevelt issued an executive order prohibiting racial discrimination in federal hiring and establishing the Fair Employment Practice Committee, FEPC. In 1942, Bayard Rustin and students led by white George Hauser and black James Farmer in the Chicago chapter of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, FOR, formed a committee that later became known as the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. They and A.J. Muste were strongly influenced by the book War Without Violence by Krishnalal Sridharani, a former associate of Gandhi. That year, Rustin was beaten and arrested for sitting at the front of buses going from Louisville to Nashville. Asserting the power of love, he stood up to the injustice and found that his nonviolent action was supported by some witnesses. In 1943, CORE activists protested by sitting in segregated Chicago restaurants. In Morgan v. Virginia, the U.S. Supreme Court in June 1946 declared unconstitutional the Virginia law requiring segregated seating on interstate buses. The next year, 16 people from FOR and CORE undertook a journey of reconciliation to test the judgment, and 4 writers arrested in North Carolina were sentenced to 30 days on a chain gang. Meanwhile, the FEPC was not too effective because it lacked the power to enforce the law, and Congress ended its funding in 1946. In 1944, Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal published a massive study on race relations called An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, describing the conflict between the American creed of equal rights with the actual discrimination against Negroes. In December 1946, President Harry Truman appointed a committee on civil rights that filed a scathing report on the crimes of lynching, police brutality, discrimination in public accommodations, and the lack of justice in the courts. They found that separate but equal had failed and that the rights to voting and education had not yet been secured. They recommended magnifying the civil rights section in the Justice Department, establishing a commission on civil rights under the president, making state and local police forces more professional, and action by Congress to protect voting rights and equal access to employment, education, and public services. In March 1948, Randolph warned President Truman that he would lead a civil disobedience campaign to protest segregation in the military. In July, Truman issued an executive order for equal opportunity in the armed services, and Randolph ended his call for civil disobedience. Thurgood Marshall became chief counsel for the NAACP in 1940, and in 1946 he set up the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. At an NAACP conference in New York in 1950, he argued that the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy v. Ferguson from 1896 was unconstitutional by the 14th Amendment because separate schools could not be equal. In 1951, Marshall and NAACP attorneys challenged school segregation in South Carolina, Kansas, and Delaware. On May 17, 1954, the new U.S. Chief Justice Earl Warren announced a unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson and accepting the plaintiff's argument by the NAACP lawyers that segregation has a detrimental effect on colored children, making separate educational facilities inherently unequal. Implementation was delayed by another hearing, but a year later the Supreme Court decided that educational authorities have the primary responsibility to solve these problems and must admit students on a racially non-discriminatory basis with all deliberate speed. The first major challenge came in September 1957, when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus used the National Guard to deny 9 Negro children admission to Central High School in Little Rock. A district court ordered him to remove the guard, and he did so, but the black students were assaulted by an angry mob. President Eisenhower then ordered the mob blocking the students to disperse and made a speech announcing that he was sending in 1,000 paratroopers to enforce the law by protecting the minority students. King and the Montgomery bus boycott. From 1956 until his tragic assassination in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was the foremost leader in African Americans' nonviolent quest for civil rights and a better life. He was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, and was named after his father, who was a successful Baptist preacher. His father taught him self-respect in the face of racial discrimination. Martin started at Morehouse College in Atlanta when he was only 15, and he graduated 4 years later. Choosing the ministry over medicine and law, he attended Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania for 3 years. While there, he heard A.J. Muste lecture, and after hearing Mordecai Johnson lecture on Gandhi, he went out and bought every book he could find on Gandhi and nonviolence. Martin had already read Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience at Morehouse College. He was so moved by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system that he reread it several times. In his theological studies, he leaned toward the social gospel of Walter Rauschenbusch. He read Marx and rejected his materialism and deprecation of individual freedom. However, he also questioned the materialism and injustices of capitalism. In reading Gandhi, King realized that the love ethic of Jesus could go beyond individuals and be applied to the conflicts of racial groups and nations. He discovered the method for social reform in Gandhi's soul force, satyagraha, and nonviolence, ahimsa. After being elected student body president and graduating first in his class at Crozer, King moved on to Boston University, where he earned his Ph.D. in theology. In 1953, he married Coretta Scott, a bright student of music, and they eventually had 4 children. Believing in the guidance of a personal God and equipped with the techniques of nonviolence, King accepted a pastorate in Montgomery, Alabama, hoping he could help his people achieve social justice. King had only recently completed his doctoral dissertation and gotten settled in the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church when the issue of racial segregation on the public buses erupted in Montgomery. On May 17, 1954, the United States Supreme Court had declared separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And in 1955, the same court ordered all public schools to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. In Montgomery, King had become active in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and in the Integrated Alabama Council on Human Relations. In March 1955, a 15-year-old girl had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on the bus. King was on the committee that protested this, but no action was taken. On December 1, 1955, Mrs. Rosa Parks felt her feet were too tired for her to stand up for a white man who had boarded after her. The bus driver ordered her to stand up and give her seat to the white man, but she refused. She was arrested and taken to the courthouse. From there, she called E.D. Nixon, who in turn made several calls. The Women's Political Council proposed a one-day boycott of the buses. The next morning, which was a Friday, Nixon called King, and he offered the Dexter Avenue Church as a meeting place for that night. Over 40 black leaders showed up, and they agreed to boycott the buses on the following Monday and hold a mass meeting Monday night. Leaflets were mimeographed and distributed announcing these actions. Committees were organized, and alternative transportation was arranged. Recalling Thoreau's words about not cooperating with an evil system, King thought of the movement as massive non-cooperation. The word spread, and on Monday morning the Montgomery buses were practically empty except for a few white passengers. Mrs. Parks was convicted that morning of disobeying the city's segregation ordinance and fined $10 and court costs. Her attorney appealed. That afternoon, Dr. King was elected president of what became the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA. The Holt Street Baptist Church had 5,000 people standing outside listening to loudspeakers for the evening meeting. King spoke for the hearts of many when he declared that they were tired of being segregated and humiliated. He affirmed that their only alternative was to protest for freedom and justice. Christian love and nonviolent principles provided the basis for his advice. No one must be intimidated to keep them from riding the buses. He said, "Our method will be that of persuasion, not coercion. We will only say to the people, 'Let your conscience be your guide.'" He quoted the statement by Booker T. Washington, not to let anyone drag you down so low as to make you hate him. King concluded his speech, "If you will protest courageously and yet with dignity and Christian love, when the history books are written in future generations, the historians will have to pause and say, There lived a great people of black people who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. This is our challenge and our overwhelming responsibility. Ralph Abernathy proposed 3 moderate demands, which were unanimously approved at the mass meeting. 1. Courteous treatment by bus operators. 2. Passengers to be seated on a first-come, first-served basis with Negroes in the back and whites in the front. And 3. Negro bus drivers to be employed in predominantly Negro routes. In his book, Stride Toward Freedom, King explained how Christian love and nonviolent methods guided the movement and how he spoke in weekly meetings. I stressed that the use of violence in our struggle would be both impractical and immoral. To meet hate with retaliatory hate would do nothing but intensify the existence of evil in the universe. Hate begets hate. Violence begets violence. Toughness begets a greater toughness. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. We must meet physical force with soul force. Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding. Although to King nonviolence was a way of life, he was glad that the black people were willing to accept it as a method. He presented it simply as Christianity in action. In Stride Toward Freedom, King elucidated 6 key points about the philosophy of nonviolence. First, it is not based on cowardice. Although it may seem passive physically, it is spiritually active, requiring the courage to stand up against injustice. Second, nonviolence does not seek to defeat the opponent, but rather to win his understanding, to create the beloved community. Third, the attack is directed at the evil, not at the people who are doing the evil. For King, the conflict was not between whites and blacks, but between justice and injustice. Fourth, in nonviolence there is a willingness to accept suffering without retaliating. Fifth, not only is physical violence avoided, but also spiritual violence. Love replaces hatred. Sixth, nonviolence has the faith that justice will prevail because it is a universal law. Meanwhile, to get people to work and back, black taxi companies had lowered their fares. Carpools were arranged and many people walked. However, the city prohibited the tax companies from doing this business and threatened people with vagrancy and illegal hitchhiking charges. Rumors spread that drivers might lose their licenses or insurance. King was arrested in January for driving 30 in a 25-mile-per-hour zone, even though he was driving very carefully since he was aware of being followed. The King's house was bombed. Coretta and a friend escaped injury by moving quickly to the back of the house. Martin rushed home from his meeting, and a furious mob gathered outside. He calmed them down and advised them to put down their weapons and go home. He said, "We cannot solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with nonviolence. We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us." When the mayor tried to speak, he was booed and threatened. But King quieted the crowd. His presence and words had prevented a bloody riot. The Kings often received threatening phone calls, but even after the bomb blast, King would not allow a weapon in his house. While King was away lecturing at Fisk University in Nashville, the Montgomery attorney began arresting MIA leaders for violating an old state law against boycotts. Against the advice of his father, Martin returned to Montgomery to be placed under arrest. He was released on bail. On March 22nd, Judge Carter found 89 defendants guilty. King was sentenced to pay a fine of $500 or serve 386 days hard labor. Appeals were filed. On June 4, 1956, a federal court held that bus segregation was unconstitutional. However, the city attorneys appealed to the United States Supreme Court. In November, the city tried to ban the carpools. While they were in a Montgomery court on this charge, The Supreme Court affirmed the decision declaring Alabama state and local laws requiring segregation on buses unconstitutional. Reverend King told a mass meeting that they must act with calm dignity and wise restraint, and not let their emotions run wild. He said, "We must now move from protest to reconciliation." Meetings were held to prepare the people for integration of the buses. Training sessions in nonviolent techniques enabled actors to play out different roles before a critical audience, which could discuss the results. Integrated bus suggestions were printed which recommended complete nonviolence in word and action, and admonished them to be loving enough to absorb evil and understanding enough to convert an enemy into a friend. A few days before Christmas, after more than a year's boycott, the black ministers of Montgomery led the way in riding integrated buses. In January, a few acts of terrorism by the Ku Klux Klan occurred, but again King urged nonviolence and the way of the cross. After a few weeks, the transportation systems had returned to normal with integrated buses. King and SCLC campaigns. The Montgomery success gave King national prominence. Along with Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and C.K. Steele, he formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, with headquarters in Atlanta. He urged President Eisenhower to call for a White House conference on civil rights. When the Eisenhower administration failed to respond adequately, King organized a prayer pilgrimage of freedom, which drew 37,000 marchers to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington on May 17, 1957. King led the cry of blacks for the ballot so that they could participate more fully in the legislative process. In 1958, Stride Toward Freedom came out calling for a militant and nonviolent mass movement. King suggested in this book that if they remain nonviolent, then public opinion will be magnetically attracted to them rather than to the instigators of violence. A nonviolent mass movement is power under discipline seeking justice. He summarized his nonviolent intentions this way: "We will take direct action against injustice without waiting for other agencies to act. We will not obey unjust laws or submit to unjust practices. We will do this peacefully, openly, cheerfully, because our aim is to persuade. We adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself. We will try to persuade with our words, but if our words fail, we will try to persuade with our acts. We will always be willing to talk and seek fair compromise, but we are ready to suffer when necessary and even risk our lives to become witnesses to the truth as we see it." He pointed out that nonviolence first affects the hearts of those committed to it, gives them greater self-respect and courage, and then it stirs the conscience of the opponents until reconciliation is achieved. He warned against using power to oppress others. In an effort to achieve freedom in America, Asia, and Africa, we must not try to leap from a position of disadvantage to one of advantage, thus subverting justice. We must seek democracy, and not the substitution of one tyranny for another. Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man. We must not become victimized with a philosophy of black supremacy. God is not interested merely in the freedom of black men and brown men and yellow men. God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race. King suggested the constructive program ahead must include a campaign to get Negroes to register and vote. He also warned that in a world of ballistic missiles, the choice was no longer between violence and nonviolence, but between nonviolence and non-existence. On Lincoln's birthday in 1958, 21 mass meetings were held simultaneously in key southern cities, calling for freedom now. In September, King was arbitrarily arrested while in the Montgomery courthouse. He decided to refuse to pay bail or the fine. However, the officials preferred to pay his fine for him so that the taxpayers would not have to feed King for 14 days. While autographing copies of his book in New York, a psychotic woman stabbed King in the chest with a sharp letter opener. He remained calm and waited for a surgeon to remove the knife-like weapon. Its point had been touching his aorta. He was told that if he had merely sneezed, he probably would have died. In February 1959, Martin Luther King made a pilgrimage to India and returned even more confirmed in the principles of nonviolence. In December, King called for a broad and bold progress in the Southern Campaign for Equality. In 1960, student activists organized numerous sit-ins at lunch counters in order to end discrimination. King and James Lawson spoke on nonviolence at a meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was formed. King and 36 others were arrested for sitting at the lunch counter in Rich's department store in Atlanta. The judge sentenced King to 6 months hard labor. This was on October 25th, and the election was only a few days away. President Eisenhower considered making a public statement, but he and Vice President Nixon decided not to comment. However, John Kennedy and his brother Robert made some phone calls urging King's release. Some say that this gesture helped King win the election over Nixon by a narrow margin. King was elected chairman of the Committee on the Freedom Rides in 1961. To protect the Freedom Riders from the onslaught of violence, King requested Attorney General Robert Kennedy to send more federal marshals. King explained, "The law may not be able to make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me." The Freedom Rides took the civil rights movement from the urban college campuses to the rural hamlets of the South. King answered the call to help the movement in Albany, Georgia, to desegregate public parks and other facilities. He and Ralph Abernathy were arrested in December 1961 for refusing to disperse. They were tried the following February and sentenced on July 10, 1962, to pay a fine or be imprisoned at hard labor for 45 days. They chose prison. Again, an anonymous person paid the fines. King then announced a civil disobedience campaign. However, when 2,000 people threw rocks and bottles at the police, he called for a day of penitence and a week of prayer vigils. King, Abernathy, and Dr. Anderson were arrested at the first vigil. They spent 2 weeks in jail before the trial and then were given suspended sentences. A new demonstration was planned after their release, but this time the city obtained a federal injunction against the demonstration. Since the federal courts had always been their ally, King reluctantly canceled the march. Many considered the Albany campaign a failure because it did not achieve desegregation. But King felt they learned tactical lessons and through increased voter registration began to affect elections more. 5% of the black population had accepted nonviolence and had gone willingly to jail. Fred Shuttlesworth of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights had been working to desegregate Birmingham, but he was meeting much resistance. He requested the help of the SCLC, and in April 1963, after the elections involving Eugene Bull Connor, they acted. Their organization had improved since Albany, and workshops on nonviolence and direct action techniques were conducted. They began with sit-ins involving a few arrests each day. Mass meetings with talks on nonviolence were held each evening. Many volunteers came forward, and the movement grew into a nonviolent army. Each volunteer signed the following commitment card. "I hereby pledge myself, my person and body, to the nonviolent movement. Therefore, I will keep the following 10 commandments. 1. Meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. 2. Remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. 3. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. 4. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. 5. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. 6. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. 7. Seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. 8. Refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. 9. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. 10. Follow the directions of the movement and of the captain on a demonstration. King chose to postpone his own arrest so that he could speak to meetings in the black community. He appealed to ministers for help in the struggle to improve social conditions. On Saturday, April 6th, 42 were arrested for parading without a permit. So far, both sides were nonviolent, and they sang on their way to jail. The boycott of the downtown merchants was effective. There were kneel-ins at churches, sit-ins at the library, and a march to the county building for voter registration. The jails began to fill. They decided to disobey a state court injunction because they felt Alabama was misusing the judicial process. Although most of the leaders wanted King to stay free in order to raise money, he asked Ralph Abernathy to go to jail with him. On Good Friday, they were arrested, and King was put in solitary confinement. Coretta contacted President Kennedy to request help in improving King's jail conditions, and Harry Belafonte was able to raise $50,000 for bail bonds. On scraps of paper, Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, in which he responded to ministers' public charges that his actions were unwise and untimely. He explained that he came to Birmingham because of the injustice there. They had gone through the 4 basic steps of a nonviolent campaign: collection of facts about injustice, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. Just as Socrates had been an intellectual gadfly, he too must struggle against injustice. He stated the hard truth. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. He quoted Augustine, who said that an unjust law is no law at all. Segregation is unjust because it damages the personality and creates false concepts of superiority and inferiority. To break an unjust law openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty is to express respect for real justice. He pointed out that what Hitler did in Germany was legal, while aiding or comforting a Jew was illegal. Their action did not create the tension, it merely brought to the surface the seething hidden tensions. Nonviolence offers a creative outlet for repressed emotions which might otherwise result in violence. He said that if he is an extremist, then like Jesus, he is an extremist for love. After 8 days, King and Abernathy accepted bail. King then suggested they enlist young people in the campaign. Andy Young sent some who were too young to the library to learn something. On May 2nd, over 1,000 youths demonstrated and went to jail. King explained in his book, Why We Can't Wait, that all ages, sexes, races, and even the disabled can be accepted into a nonviolent army. When the jails were almost full, Bull Connor changed his tactics to violence, turning on the water hoses, sending in police with their clubs, and releasing the police dogs. Moral indignation swept across the nation. On May 4th, the U.S. Attorney General sent mediators to seek a truce. On May 10th, an agreement was reached granting the major demands: desegregation of lunch counters, restrooms, fitting rooms, and drinking fountains; upgrading and hiring of blacks on a non-discriminatory basis; release of all jailed persons; and establishing communications between black and white leaders. Segregationists reacted by bombing the house of Martin's brother, A.D. King, at midnight on Saturday in order to incite a riot. Followers of the movement sang, "We shall overcome," to stop the violence. The next day, President Kennedy sent in 3,000 federal troops. On May 20th, the Supreme Court decided that demonstrations against segregated institutions are legal. Justice had triumphed. King went on a speaking tour from Los Angeles to New York. In Detroit on June 23, 1963, he led 125,000 people on a freedom walk. To this crowd, he spoke of nonviolence as a strong method of disarming the opponent. He declared, "If a man hasn't discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live." At a conference with A. Philip Randolph and Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, John Lewis of SNCC, Dorothy Height of the National Council of Negro Women, James Farmer of CORE, and Whitney Young of the Urban League, they planned a march on Washington for jobs and freedom in order to put pressure on Congress to pass President Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. Some 250,000 people, about a third of them white, congregated at the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963. Randolph introduced King as the moral leader of the nation. King began with his prepared speech about how America had given the Negro a bad check, and they had come there to collect on the promises. The great crowd's response inspired him, and he put aside his text and began to speak of his dream of equality, brotherhood, and freedom, a dream where people are not judged by their skin color, but by their character. His oratory symbolically tolled the bell of freedom so that it would ring out all across the land. When the assassination of President Kennedy was announced, King privately told Coretta that the same thing would happen to him, because this is a sick society. The following June, Dr. King and Abernathy were arrested in St. Augustine, Florida. King explained how some people were trying to stop the movement by threatening them with physical death, but he responded, "If physical death is the price that I must pay to free my white brother and all my brothers and sisters from a permanent death of the spirit, then nothing can be more redemptive." On July 2, 1964, King personally witnessed President Lyndon Johnson's signing of the Civil Rights Law. King submitted an Economic Bill of Rights to the Democratic Party Platform Committee. He suggested that the disadvantaged who have been denied so long ought to receive something comparable to the GI Bill of Rights. At age 35, Dr. Martin Luther King became the youngest person ever to receive a Nobel Prize. He accepted the prestigious award for peace on behalf of the movement, saying it was a profound recognition that nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and racial questions of our time, the need for man to overcome oppression without resorting to violence. In 1965, the push for voter registration was accelerated, and Selma, Alabama was selected as the most challenging target. Mass meetings were held there throughout January and February. On the first day of February, King and Abernathy led a march of 250 blacks and 15 whites to the courthouse, where they were all arrested. On March 5th, King spent 2.5 hours with President Johnson urging him to expedite the voting rights bill. 2 days later, he announced the 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery. Although Governor Wallace prohibited the march, King exhorted the people to stand up for what is right. SCLC's strategy was for the leaders to avoid arrest in the early stages of a campaign. Thus, King was not at the front of the march when they were met by Alabama troopers with gas masks, tear gas, clubs, horsemen with whips, and deputies with electric cattle prods. The brutal attack was cheered by whites on the sidelines. King announced that he and Abernathy would lead another march. A federal injunction was issued against it, but King made a nationwide appeal for ministers and others to join them. This time, they crossed the bridge before coming to the troopers. 1,500 people prayed on the road, and then, to avoid a violent confrontation, King asked them to turn back. That night, a white minister from Boston was murdered by 4 Klansmen in Selma. Demonstrations were held across the country, and 4,000 religious leaders picketed the White House to push for the voting rights bill. The evening of the funeral, President Johnson gave his "We Shall Overcome" speech and made the voting rights bill his top priority. The injunction against the march was lifted, and the president federalized the Alabama National Guard and sent troops to protect the marchers. On March 21st, the march was successfully carried out. When they got to Montgomery, they were a crowd of 50,000. Again, King's oratory lifted the people as he declared that they would not have to wait long for freedom, because no lie can live forever, because you will reap what you sow. Because the arm of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The Voting Rights Bill was signed on August 6, 1965.